a major de-escalation in trade tensions between the world's largest economies. US and China agreed to slash reciprocal tariffs, dialing down a trade war that has stoked fears of a global economic downturn and set markets on edge. Now, both sides will roll back rates by 115 percentage points for an initial 90-day period. This means US tariffs on Chinese goods will be slashed to 30% and Chinese levies on US goods to 10%. The revisions will be imposed by Wednesday. The joint statement followed a weekend of trade negotiations in Geneva. The meetings were the first face-to-face interactions between senior American and Chinese officials since Donald Trump returned to the White House.
The consensus from both delegations this weekend is neither side wants a decoupling. And what had occurred with these very high tariffs, as Ambassador Greer said, was the equivalent of an embargo, and neither side wants that. We do want trade. We want more balanced trade, and I think that both sides are committed to achieving that.
Beijing's Commerce Ministry described the progress as substantial and expressed hope that Washington will take the talks as a foundation to keep working with China. Now, for more, let's bring in Nick Harper, reporting live from Washington, D.C., and Deborah Wong, standing by in Shenzhen. Nick, let's start with you. We're seeing markets jumping on the news here, and some analysts have said that the swiftness of the deal was unexpected. How did we get here?
Well, that's right. Yeah, both the speed and the size of these reductions were certainly unexpected. Remember, going into the weekend, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who we heard from just a moment ago, was really trying to downplay expectations. He said it was going to be all about de-escalating first rather than negotiating any sizable trade deal. And Donald Trump had suggested a figure. He was suggesting that tariffs should be brought down to 80%. What we've seen here is obviously a much bigger reduction and happening in a much quicker fashion. We also heard from the US Trade Representative Jameson Greer. He said that the speed of this deal reflects that perhaps the differences were not so large as had been thought. And you're right, reaction from global markets is certainly positive. We've seen markets in Asia, in Europe, all jump. The Wall Street indices, they're not open yet. They will be in about an hour and a half. But futures for all three indices suggest it is going to be a bumper day for investors in the US. The Dow's already up by about 1,000 points. That's about 2.5%. The S&P around 3%. The Nasdaq is suggesting that it will be opening about 4% higher. And of course, Donald Trump is spinning all of this as a win. He said before we had the final figures come out over the weekend that a total reset had been negotiated in a friendly but constructive manner. There seemed to have been significant concern on both sides about what these very high tariffs were going to do, not just to their own economies, but to global economies as well. I think that's why we've seen them move as quickly as they have and reduced tariffs by as much as they have.
So Donald Trump spinning this as a win. Deborah, let's bring you in here. China is also committed to removing non-tariff countermeasures imposed against the U.S. since last month. Which measures will be affected, and how is Beijing planning to do so?
So since the 2nd of April, China has imposed a couple of non-tariff countermeasures. We're looking at export controls on critical minerals and rare earths that the U.S. relies very heavily on. We also saw China suspend some U.S. imports. It's launched antitrust probes, as well as put several U.S. companies like Google and NVIDIA on the unreliable entity list. So according to the joint statement, we know that China will remove all of these non-tariff countermeasures. We can expect details to emerge in the next 2 days because we know that parties must take action by the 14th of May. Now, aside from improvements in the markets that you've just heard from Nick earlier, I thought what was notable was that in China, on Chinese social media platforms, Weibo, users are commenting that the latest development reflects how China's fighting attitude has achieved a good outcome. It has also given the country an upper hand in the negotiation table. Local media and analysts have also said that the outcome basically effectively invalidated Trump's tariffs in the first place and affected his credibility. So that's what we're seeing in the immediate hours since the statement came out.
And meanwhile, both sides have agreed to launch another new economic dialogue forum. We know details are very limited at this point. Nick, what's on the table?
Well, at this stage, we've seen a significant de-escalation in tensions between both sides, but the trade war is certainly not over. Scott Bessent was speaking on CNBC here in the last hour, talking about future meetings, because that's now the plan. They will go and work out the details, but also meet again during this 90-day pause. Scott Bessent said potentially they could meet again in the next few weeks to get rolling on a more fulsome agreement. But as we heard from him earlier, both sides have already acknowledged that they do not want a decoupling. So they're trying to work out where they will meet. The suggestion is it will not be in Europe next time, but potentially here in the US or in China. So definitely both sides in a better position. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that that 30% tariff that the US still has in place on Chinese goods is very high, and it will certainly make an impact.
More consultations, meanwhile, are also expected since the pause is only for a few months. Deb, what do you think is the end goal here?
I think the end goal is really to bring back stability to the global markets. You know, China has made it clear that talks can only progress if there is a tariff reduction, and we're seeing that happen today. So there is some hope. You know, analysts are saying there is some hope that China can really contribute more to the talks to see further reduction down the road, because at the end of the day, it still wants to remain a huge player in the global economy. It wants to remain open as well. Now, analysts are saying that the 90-day pause would definitely bring some relief to SMEs. You know, going into the weekend, we actually saw some shipping agents already put in their orders for U.S.-bound containers. And we also know that at least on China's end, they're still going to be diversifying their sources of supply, regardless of how these talks pan out, because they remain cautious. Because at the end of the day, there is still a very deep lack of mutual trust on both sides. If you recall back in the previous trade war, Trump himself imposed tariffs right after what he called productive U.S.-China trade talks in 2018. Anything can happen in the next 90 days, so we'll have to watch for developments very closely. Back
Cautious optimism it is. Many thanks both. Nick Harper there in Washington, D.C., and Deborah Wong in Shenzhen.